The Yugoslav Ground Forces was the ground forces branch of the Yugoslav People's Army from March 1, 1945 until May 20, 1992, when it became the ground forces of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia under the threat of sanctions. History. The origins of JNA can be found in the Yugoslav partisan units of World War II. As a part of the anti-fascist People's Liberation War of Yugoslavia, the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia, a predecessor of JNA, was formed on December 22, 1941 in the town of Rudo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. After the liberation of the country from the Axis powers' occupation, that date was officially celebrated as the Day of the Army in the SFR Yugoslavia. In March 1945, the NOVJ was renamed the Yugoslav Army, and finally on its 10th anniversary on December 22, 1951, received the adjective Peoples. In September 1968 the territorial organization was formed to support the JNA, and on February 21, 1974 TO units were subordinated to their provinces or republics. Thus the JNA and TO became equal parts of the Yugoslav Armed Forces. IAW The 1974 Yugoslav Constitution. The land forces were divided into 6 armies allocated to the 5 republics: 1st Army Euro Northern Serbia and Vojvodina, 2nd Army Euro Southern Serbia and Kosovo, 3rd Army Euro Macedonia, 5th Army Euro Croatia, 7th Army Euro Bosnia-Herzegovina, 9th Army Euro Slovenia, included 2 corps. Plus the Coastal Naval District Euro, formerly 4th Army. Tensions between the JNA and the TO became evident as the political situation in Yugoslavia deteriorated in the 1980s. The federal government became concerned that Yugoslavia's constituent republics would use the TO to facilitate their secession from Yugoslavia, and therefore disarmed the Kosovo TO of 130,000 members. In 1988 the JNA absorbed the entire TO, with the Bosnian Serb General Blago Jadžić becoming the JNA Chief of the Armed Forces General Staff. In 1988 the armies were reorganized into military districts or regions which no longer corresponded to internal borders, thereby making it harder for the republics to control their own forces. Apart from the Proletarian Guard, a mechanized corps, the land forces infantry divisions were reorganized into 17 corps, each consisting of 4 to 8 brigades. 1991 organization, once considered the 4th strongest army in Europe with 140,000 active troops and million reserves. In 1991 the ground forces were organized in 4 military regions, which were: General Headquarters, 1st Military Region Northern Theater, Northern Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Vojvodina. Belgrade Defense Command. 3rd Mr. Skopje Southeastern Theater and Republic of Macedonia, 5th Mr. Zagreb Northwestern Theater, Split Naval Region. Southeast Croatia and the Croatian and Montenegrin coastline. 3 naval sectors controlling the Yugoslav Navy and Yugoslav Naval Infantry. 9 corps with 20,000 men in 4 brigades and support troops. In 1990 the Army had nearly completed a major overhaul of its basic force structure. It eliminated its old divisional infantry organization and established the brigade as the largest operational unit. The Army converted 10 of 12 infantry divisions into 29 tank, mechanized, and mountain infantry brigades with integral artillery, air defense, and anti-tank regiments. 1 airborne brigade was organized before 1990. The shift to brigade-level organization provided greater operational flexibility, maneuverability, and tactical initiative, and it reduced the possibility that large army units would be destroyed in set-piece engagements with an aggressor. The change created many senior field command positions that would develop relatively young and talented officers. The brigade structure also was more appropriate at a time of declining manpower. Corps. There were 17 corps. They consist of the following: Serbian Euro 12th, 21st, 24th, 37th, and 52nd, Croatian Euro 9th, 10th, 13th, and 32nd, Bosnia-Herzegovinian Euro 4th, 5th, and 17th, Macedonian Euro 41st and 42nd, Slovene Euro 14th and 31st, Montenegrin Euro 2nd. Each corps contained the following: Corps Headquarters Troops, Corps Combat Support Euro 3 Artillery Regiments, and 6 battalions, medical, and replacement. Corps combat forces consisted of 4 armoured motorised brigades, plus infantry, light infantry, and mountain brigades. During the course of the 10-year-long Yugoslav wars, corps were modified by being reinforced with extra units from out of theatre. Battalions then became regiments and regiments became brigades. However, many units were also disbanded when their non-Serbian Montenegrin personnel deserted. Personnel: in the 1980s the land forces had about 140,000 active duty soldiers and could mobilize over 1 million trained reservists in wartime. Most soldiers were of Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian or Montenegrin origin. Reserve forces were organized along republics' lines into partisan forces and territorial defense forces, and in wartime they were to be subordinate to JNA supreme commanders, an integral part of defense system. Territorial defense was made up of former conscripts and they were occasionally called up for war exercises. The ground forces were infantry, armor, artillery, and air defense, as well as signal, engineering and chemical defense corps. Operations: see also, Yugoslav Wars and 10-Day War. The 10-Day War During the 10-Day War the JNA performed abysmally, as many of the Yugoslav soldiers did not realize they were taking part in a real military operation, rather an exercise, until they came under attack. The officer corps was dominated by Serbs and Montenegrins and in many cases ideologically committed to Yugoslav unity. The rank-and-file troops, however, were conscripts, many who had no strong motivation in fighting against the Slavons. Of the soldiers of the 5th Military District, which was in action in Slovenia, in 1990 30% were Albanians, 20% Croats, 15 to 20% Serbs and Montenegrins, 10% Bosniaks, and 8% Slavons. The JNA eventually lost nearly all of its Slovenian and Croat personnel, becoming an almost entirely Serbian and Montenegrin force. Its poor performance in Slovenia and later in Croatia discredited its leadership. Kadijević resigned as defense minister in January 1992, and Ada Three-Quarters was forced into medical retirement shortly afterwards. Due to the short duration and relatively low intensity of the war, casualties were low. According to Slovenian estimates, the JNA suffered 44 fatalities and 146 wounded, while 4,692 JNA soldiers and 252 federal police officers were captured by the Slovenian side. According to post-war assessments made by the JNA, its material losses amount to 31 tanks, 22 armored personnel carriers, 6 helicopters, 6,787 infantry weapons, 87 artillery pieces and 124 air defense weapons damaged, destroyed or confiscated. Property damage was fairly light, due to the scattered and short-term nature of the fighting. Infantry: the ground forces led in personnel. It had about 540,000 active duty soldiers and could mobilize over 1 million trained reservists in wartime. Reserve forces were organized along republics' lines into territorial defense forces, and in wartime they were to be subordinate to JNA supreme commanders, an integral part of defense system. Territorial defense was made up of former conscripts and they were occasionally called up for war exercises. The ground forces were infantry, armor, artillery, and air defense, as well as signal, engineering and chemical defense corps. Equipment: assault rifles, Sastava M70. Machine guns, Sastava M84, Sastava M72, Sastava M77. Submachine guns, Scorpion VZ. 61. Sniper rifles, Sastava M76. Pistols, CZ99. Launchers, M80 rocket launcher, M79 OSA. Gallery. Tank and armored brigades: Yugoslav tank brigades comprised 2 or 3 battalions each with 31 tanks in 3 10-tank companies. They operated 11-14 Soviet T-54s and T-55s, 73 Soviet T-72s, 443 Yugoslav M-84s, and some United States-made M-47 tanks. The Army's tanks were in many respects its most obsolete forces. The T-54/-55 was a frontline model during the 1960s. Domestic production of the M84 was providing the Army with a late 1970s and 1980s model. The Army also had a reserve of old T-34 85ths and Sherman tanks from World War II. The Yugoslav Army had 955 M80 AIFBs and 551 M60P armored personnel carriers produced domestically. The infantry also operated more than 200 Soviet-made BTR-152, BTR-40, and BTR-50 armored personnel carriers, which had been purchased in the 1960s and 1970s. It had 100 M3A1 half-tracked personnel carriers produced by the United States and a small number of new Romanian TAB-72 armored personnel carriers. Armored reconnaissance vehicles included a few older Soviet BTR-40s, newer BRDM-2 and BTR-60 models, and domestic BOV and M8 vehicles. Equipment equals, light tanks .76 a €63. Medium tanks, M4 Sherman a €630, T-34 85ths a €889, M47 Patton a €319, T-55 a €1614. Main battle tanks, T-72 a €73, M84 a €443. Tank destroyers, Su-100 a €40, 2 S-1 Gvozdika a €100, M18 Hellcat a €260, M36 Jackson a €300. APCs, MTLB a €200, OTM60 a €551, BTR50 a €120, BTR60 a €80. IFVs, M80A a €995. Armored reconnaissance vehicles, BRDM-2 a €50, BOVAPC a €317. Artillery, Yugoslav artillery regiments were well equipped with Soviet, U.S. and domestic systems. Soviet artillery in these units consisted of approximately 1,000 towed 122 mm howitzers, 130 mm guns, 152 mm gun howitzers, and 155 mm howitzers. There were about 700 older United States 105 mm and 155 mm towed guns and domestically produced models such as the M65 in the artillery regiments. Towed pieces were very important for operations in the country's mountainous terrain. Artillery units operated Soviet 100 mm and 122 mm and Yugoslav-produced 105 mm M7 self-propelled guns. Those units had over 8,082 mm and 120 mm mortars, including a self-propelled 82 mm mortar mounted on an M60PB variant of the standard armored personnel carrier. Yugoslav artillery units operated several battlefield missile systems including 160 128 mm YMRL-32 and M63 multiple rocket launchers. The arsenal included 4 launchers for Soviet Frog-7 surface-to-surface missiles. First fielded in 1967, the unguided Frog-7 had a range of 100 kilometers. Equipment equals, mountain artillery, M48. Towed artillery, M56. D30 a €120, D74 a euro. M46 a €250 a €300. D20 a €136, M84 Nora a €200 a €300. Rocket artillery, M63 Plummen a €800, M77 OGANJ a €120, M87 Orkan a €10, Frog-7 a €10. Anti-tank regiments, Yugoslav anti-tank regiments had towed anti-tank guns, recoilless rifles, and Soviet anti-tank guided missiles. Anti-tank guns included 75 mm, 90 mm, and 100 mm models. They were Soviet-produced with the exception of the 90 mm M63B2, which was manufactured domestically. The recoilless rifles were manufactured domestically and included 57 mm, 82 mm, and 105 mm models. Two self-propelled 82mm recoilless rifles could be mounted on an M60PB armored personal carrier. Anti-tank guided missiles were the Soviet AT-1 and AT-3. They were used in both anti-tank and infantry units, but because of their early vintage, effectiveness against advanced armor was uncertain. The four-wheeled BOV-1 armored reconnaissance vehicle could be equipped with 6 AT-3 launchers to serve as a highly mobile anti-tank platform. Air defense. Larger Yugoslav army units had considerable tactical air defense assets, designed to defend major troop concentrations against enemy airstrikes. The ground forces had 4 surface-to-air missile regiments and 11 anti-aircraft artillery regiments. The former operated large numbers of Soviet SA-6, SA-7, SA-9, SA-13, SA-14, SA-16 missiles. Short-range systems also were employed in infantry units. Yugoslav anti-aircraft artillery regiments operated over 5,000 guns. Self-propelled gun systems included the Soviet-made 57mm dual ZSU-57-2 gun systems and the domestically produced triple 20mm BOV-3s and dual 30mm BOV-30s. Large numbers of towed anti-aircraft guns of many calibers were in the inventory. Of both domestic and foreign origin, they included pieces purchased from the United States, Czechoslovakia, Switzerland, and Sweden. Equipment anti-aircraft systems, 57mm AZPS-60 €, M55 €, Bofors 40mm. Self-propelled anti-aircraft systems, BOV-330 €100, M53/59 Praga €789, ZSU-57-2 €100. Manpads, SCHLA-2 €4700, 9K34 SCHLA-3, 9K38 Igala. SAMs, 9K31 SCHLA-1 €120, 9K35 SCHLA-10 €18, S75 Vina €60, S125 Nava €60, 2K12 Cub €80 to 90. Coastal defense. The coastal artillery batteries had both surface-to-surface missiles and guns. They operated the Soviet-designed SSC-3 and a truck-mounted, Yugoslav-produced Brum anti-ship missile which was essentially a Yugoslav variant of the Soviet SSN-2. Coastal guns included over 485mm, 88mm, 122mm, 130mm, and 152mm artillery pieces obtained from the Soviet Union, the United States, captured and refurbished WW2 German and Italian pieces, and Yugoslav manufacturers. Rank and uniforms. Rank equals. According to the Army Law of October 1, 1982, the land forces had 5 categories of ranks: general officers, senior officers, junior officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers. Enlisted, the soldier and NCO ranks were private first class, corporal, junior sergeant, sergeant, sergeant first class, senior sergeant first class, warrant officer, and warrant officer first class. Privates first class, corporals, and junior sergeants wore 1, 2, and 3 red chevrons, respectively, on a background of olive green, blue-gray, or black corresponding, respectively, to the ground forces, Air Force, or Navy. In the land forces and air forces, sergeants first class, senior sergeants, and senior sergeants first class wore single thin yellow gold chevrons with 1, 2, 3, and 4 yellow gold stars, respectively. Warrant officers and warrant officers first class wore 2 yellow gold chevrons with 1 and 2 gold stars respectively. Officers, insignia for commissioned officers were worn in shoulder boards in olive green for the land forces. Shoulder boards were piped with single and double yellow gold braid, respectively, for junior and senior officers. General officers wore shoulder boards piped with twisted gold cord. Junior officer ranks were sub-lieutenant, lieutenant, lieutenant, captain, and captain first class, and their shoulder boards had 1, 2, 3, and 4 small yellow gold stars, respectively. Senior officer ranks were major, lieutenant colonel, and colonel, and their shoulder boards bore 1, 2, or 3 large yellow gold stars respectively. General officer ranks were major general, lieutenant colonel general, colonel general, and general of the army. General was the rank created for Federal Secretary of People's Defense in 1955, and it was abolished in 1974. Army general officers wore a crossed sword and cannon in 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 gold stars. Tito was the only person to hold the rank of marshal, and the position was abolished shortly after his death. The shoulder board insignia featured the emblem of Yugoslavia. Uniforms equals. Enlisted and Ncos, soldiers and Ncos were issued uniforms, field and service uniforms, while Ncos were authorized to dress uniform. Military school cadets wore soldiers' uniforms. Soldiers' winter and summer uniforms were made of light or heavy wool and cotton in olive green. All soldiers wore neckties of the same colors except in summer, when the uniform shirt was worn with an open collar. There were several variations on the basic soldier's uniform, and women's uniforms were of the same style as those for men, with a skirt being substituted for trousers. Paratroops wore an olive green beret instead of the standard garrison or service cap. Mountain troops wore distinctive steer field caps with semi-rigid visors and ear flaps. They wore loose winter shirts under which additional layers could be worn. The shirt itself had a lining and a collar that could be turned up to cover the neck and chin. The trousers worn by mountain troops extended just below the knee, with a strap and buckle closure. Leather leggings, heavy wool socks, and foul-weather capes also were worn by the mountain troops. Several different patterns of camouflage uniforms were worn by select units. Officers had to buy their field, service, dress, and full-dress uniforms. They wore insignia on the lapels of the field uniform shirts. The service uniform differed only in a few details from the basic dress uniform. The shirt buttons of the dress uniform were yellow-gold instead of the service color. The trousers, jackets, and overcoats were piped red along the seams. The dress cap visor showed the same piping as the officers' shoulder boards. The general officer's dress cap had a chin strap with twisted gold cord. Other officers wore plain plastic or leather chin straps. Full dress uniforms were blue and were worn with a yellow-gold sash belt lined with the appropriate service color. Cap emblems all included a red star with yellow-gold rays, given distinctive configurations according to branch. Airborne officers had the red star resting on a silver parachute against a blue background. Cap emblems for general officers showed the same gold wreath as the shoulder boards. See also, Partisans, Front Illustrated Paper, Serbian Land Forces, Croatian Ground Army. References. Logistika, Naujuzanji I Ratna Enika UOSSFRJ I Novonastajlim Tsavama, Kopman Viskna Prostorima ex Udzava Odnastanka Dudanas. Further reading, Jane's Intelligence Review, June 1993.